Morning everyone and welcome to this Centre for London public webinar and launch of our report Third Age City Housing for Older Londoners. We're so very pleased to have you with us today. It's great to see so many people here, especially as certainly where I am, the weather is suddenly quite beautiful, so I really would have understood if you'd felt that now was a really good moment to go for a walk or a run or a bike ride. I think I've met quite a lot of people who are certainly among our panellists today, if not in the audience. My name's Claire Harding, I'm the Research Director here at Centre for London and I'll be your chair today. Just a few words about Centre for London, although I'm sure many of you know us very well and have heard this myriad times before. We're the capital's dedicated think tank, and we develop new solutions to London's critical challenges, of which there do seem to be quite a lot at the moment, and advocate for a fair, sustainable and prosperous global city. We publish research, we stage events like this one, and we work to convene and influence in turn try to get the policy change that Londoners need. In this particular, our most recent project, we sought to understand the nature of London's growing older population, the types of housing and support services that are available for them, and the policy implications for the coming decades. This really is quite a long-term sort of project for us. And through our research, we came to understand, at least to a degree, older Londoners' aspirations and concerns, what bothers them about their housing, this hugely diverse group, and what the challenges and opportunities they see are in the city. And it became apparent quite quickly, I think, that the housing available in London doesn't meet the needs and wants of all of our older people by any means. And this isn't just about older people themselves, and that's been really key to us throughout this project. Providing the right homes in the right places for older people benefits us all, because older people make absolutely huge contributions to our communities and to our economy through their own, although that said, older people's own needs and choices, rather than these benefits to wider society, are the big focus of our report. So you won't hear me today going on and on about how we need to get older people to move out of their big houses so families can live in those big houses. This isn't about that, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that it's important to everybody. It's important to me to have my older relatives around. It's important to high streets to have older people as customers. This is about valuing a really important part of our society. We've considered quite a lot of things. We've looked at innovative approaches to specialist housing, we've looked at community and in-home support, and more broadly at the extent to which the city is making itself livable and adaptable to the needs of its growing population. So that goes well beyond our front doors for older residents, and how we can enable people to participate fully in civic life, which, as many of you will know, is another thing that we really like talking about here at Centre for London. Before we move on with this webinar, I'd like to thank the sponsors of this project. It's been really great, the level of interest and support we've had for this. It's been a really lovely thing to see. So thank you to our major sponsors, British Land and Riverstone, and to supporting sponsors, Enfield Council, the London Borough of Barnet, the London Borough of Sutton, Popular Living, the Royal Borough of Greenwich, and the Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames. First up today, we have Jason Leek, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Riverstone, to share with us his views on specialist housing for older Londoners, in inner London in particular, and why policymakers need to make it easier for this to develop. Thank you so very much Thank you so very much for joining us, Jason.
Thanks very much, Claire. And thank you for inviting me. We're delighted to be involved with this. We're delighted to sponsor it. I'm really delighted to endorse the recommendations that you're going to hear today. And anything we can do to encourage policymakers to understand and therefore support the opportunity for better housing for Londoners going forwards for the older demographic. So let me just, I won't do an advert on Riverstone, but let me just tell you one or two bits. I'm the CEO of Riverstone. I've been living in London for more than 30 years, so passionate about the city. Riverstone's a developer and will be an operator of specialist housing for over 65s. And what we're providing is apartments for people. We're building our first 2 developments in Fulham and Kensington. And these are between 150 and 200 apartments. But the critical thing is that these include lots of facilities for people so that we can build a community. We can give people lovely apartments, but with amenities to encourage well-being, to encourage collaboration, to encourage people to carry on with activities in later life. And we also include care, and that is available if you need it, so that people can continue living well, they can continue living independently, and hopefully they can continue with a healthy lifespan as long as possible. Because plenty of research shows that these sorts of environments and these sorts of facilities really encourage and enable people to live well in later life. But we're very conscious that what we're doing is part of the choice, and it's absolutely critical that people have different choices. So we're passionate about the industry growing as a whole to provide people with different choices at different price points, with different facilities, but really encouraging the right options for people for the next stage of their life as they get older. I mean, historically, there have been care homes, but that has been not aspirational. Those have tended to be an environment where they're a fantastic service, but when people need it. What we're doing, and hopefully others are doing now in the industry, is making these sorts of environments more aspirational as great places to live in your later years. And I think I won't talk about COVID, but the simple thing is to say that I think all that has done is make these environments look more attractive as providing help and community and support and people on hand to help you live well in your later years. And the evidence shows it. So all of our research shows that at least 40% of people at this age group want to downsize and are open to downsizing, but they don't have the options to do so. There just is not the supply, and there just are not the options there for them to do that. And if you look by comparison, so if you look to the US market or Australia, New Zealand, these are markets that have between 5 and 6% of over 65s living in these types of specialist accommodation. London is at less than 0.5%. So there really is very little availability. So hopefully what we're doing and what others are doing in the industry will bring really great opportunities for people to move into the type of environment that they're looking for. And we're focused on London because our evidence shows that people want to stay in the city they live in, that they've worked in, that they've grown up in, or for many years lived in. They don't want to move out of London just because they've reached a certain age. They want to continue in the environments that they're in. So for us, we're building currently in Fulham and Kensington, but we're looking at multiple other projects with an ambition to build a portfolio of around 2,000 apartments over the next 5 to 7 years in multiple different parts of London. So we're passionate about providing the right environment for people. And in that context, we're hugely passionate about the support that Centre for London are giving in both analysing, researching, and then providing information for people so that they can help support the policy environment that creates both investment, but also momentum towards more building and therefore more options for people. So I'll leave it there by way of brief introduction, and I'll hand back to Claire.
Thanks so much, Jason. That was really interesting, and particularly what you said about people wanting the option to stay in London. That's something that's come up so much as we've spoken to people. Lots of people do want to move to the country when they get older, but possibly not quite as many people as are commonly assumed to. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Nikita, who together with my colleague Erica, who's in the audience, has done the vast amount of the hard work on this project. So I know a lot of you have already spoken to Nikita through interviews and setting up meetings. And Nikita is going to do a very high level run through of what we found in the research. Of course, these presentations can only ever be partial because we get so much lovely, rich, interesting data, and then we try to boil it down to about 10 slides. But of course, there's an awful lot more detail in the report, which you all should already have a link to if you'd like to look into this in any more detail. Thank you so much, Nikita.
Thank you, Claire. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, thank you, Claire, for that introduction. My name is Nikita Quarshie, and I'm a researcher at Centre for London, as well as one of the writers of the report alongside Claire Harding and Erica Belcher. So I'm really excited to be delivering this presentation, actually. I think it's quite easy to view this subject, or at least I know was the case for me when I first joined this project, to view the issue of housing for older Londoners as something that concerns only a specific part of our population. But in fact, it should matter to all of us, and it does concern all of us. Hopefully, it's not too much of a shock to say that we are all aging. And though it might not be at the forefront of our minds right now, I'm sure we care about being able to age in a city that supports us as we do so, and that allows us to thrive at every stage of our lives. This subject is also important because housing isn't just an isolated policy issue, but it's very much related to think about how we approach health and quality of life. So just to give you an overview of how this presentation will unfold, I'll begin by asking and answering what older Londoners need before moving on to what currently exists, then addressing why the need for specialist housing isn't being met, before concluding with the recommendations from our report. So what do older Londoners need? We tend to think of London as quite a young city, but in fact, by 2030, there are projected to be over 1.4 million older people living in London. Now, this is almost the amount of people living in Birmingham right now. And crucially, this population increase is projected to be highest in inner London. Now, accommodating this growth in a way that supports older people in living healthy, social, and prosperous lives will, of course, be challenging. However, providing the right housing is a key step in creating a fairer and more inclusive London that allows all of us to thrive as we age. So what kind of housing will an aging population need? Now, of course, the needs and desires of older people will be different. They're not a homogeneous group, and they're diverse in their experiences, their aspirations, and their desires. But there are still some consistent themes. First of all, good homes are spacious. Older people need space for their evolving needs, new customs, and a lifetime of possessions and relationships, yet not too much to the extent that becomes a burden to navigate or take care of. Good homes for older people are also easy to adapt. Homes that are adaptable and flexible make it easier for people to stay in them as they age and can support those with health problems and disabilities to live independently. So examples include features like step-free entrances to the house, bathrooms that are level with the entrance, and plug sockets at waist height. I think it's worth noting that many of these features are also just useful to other types of residents, whether or not they're older or have disabilities. For example, step-free access and wide hallways make life much easier for parents with pushchairs, and also just for cyclists, for example, who keep bikes in the outdoor space. Good homes for older people are also well integrated into the surrounding area. The right location is just as important as the right home, and planning for older people's housing needs to take the public realm, transport, and other services into account. Proximity to supermarkets, hospitals, GP practices, and other essential services means that older people can avoid long, often tiring journeys, and affordable and quality public transport links become even more important for people who don't live near these amenities. I think generally also areas should just feel safe and increase people's confidence in moving around. Now, good homes are also placed in green areas and offer access to open and well-kept green spaces. This came out quite strongly in the interviews we had with older Londoners, for example, especially within the context of the pandemic. It was often said that local parks and features such as communal gardens became especially important and good sources of respite. And it's quite interesting actually, because last week we released our London Intelligence Report, which is a quarterly survey of London through data. And what came out was the fact that older people tended to be happier than young people with their local parks and public spaces. Finally, good homes for older people are able to support them in leading social and healthy lives. When thinking about housing for older people, it's important that we pay particular attention to placemaking and provide opportunities for older people to participate in their communities and have a say in shaping their neighborhoods. Given the diversity of London, we should identify and consider intersectional barriers to participation. Now, imagine you're thinking that this just sounds like good design and good housing. And I think that's exactly the point. Designing good homes and places for, but also with older people very much stands to benefit all of us. So what currently exists right now? Older people generally have 4 main options available to them as they age: staying in their current home, living in a care home, living with family or friends, or living in specialist housing. Now, even within these options, there are variations in the type of housing, such as co-housing and intergenerational homes, which we look at a bit more closely in our report. I want to emphasize that, of course, there's no single correct type of housing for older people per se. Again, the right choice will really depend on the person. However, the choice will also depend and is largely constrained by the availability of options. 90% of older Londoners live in general needs mainstream homes, but any approach to older people's housing will require more specialist housing alongside ordinary homes. Specialist housing come in different forms, depending on the level of support provided, and include retirement homes, sheltered retirement communities, and extra care accommodation. Specialist housing is particularly important because it provides older people with a middle option between remaining in their current home and moving into a care home. It can make it easier for people to live in their own home for longer, maintain an active social and community life, and access increasing levels of care as their needs change. Currently, there is less of a shortage of care homes for older people than there is of specialist housing. However, there is still a risk that demand for care homes will increase if older people cannot find housing that suits their needs. So why isn't the need for specialist housing being met? London has some way to go in reaching its targets for building specialist housing. The city is currently developing less than half of the older people's specialist housing in needs, and the problem is more deeply felt in inner London. So what this looks like is that we have a situation where in some boroughs, the number of new units completed is actually negative, as existing older people's accommodation is converted to other users, usually student or general needs housing. There are a number of linked barriers to meeting London's need for specialist housing. On one hand, there are the commercial factors. So supply is likely to be limited because of factors such as high land prices that make it difficult to develop properties that are affordable for older people, but still meet their requirements. Staffing costs in extra care settings can also be very expensive in London. And as I mentioned before, specialist housing faces competition from student and general needs housing that bring in higher returns. This supply problem is paired with issues in demand. So in general, older people tend to be more exacting customers when deciding where to live. And rightly so, of course, this is a massive decision. But demand is also driven down by a lack of trust in the sector and suggestions that fear of coronavirus has made people more reluctant to move into care homes. Now, there are also policy and regulatory factors to contend with. The complexity of the current planning system and planning classes can slow down and complicate the planning permission process for both new builds and changes of use. Additionally, targets for the number of older people's homes to be built in each borough isn't always reflected in borough-level policies. Finally, while care homes are regulated, there isn't a statutory definition for other types of older people's housing or agreed quality standards in planning. Now, I want to emphasize that building new and better homes won't be enough. Many older people, and in fact, rising older people, lack knowledge of the types of housing that might be available if they moved from their current home. In particular, they may lack knowledge of the differences between specialist housing and care homes. We need to ensure older people have a genuine choice about where they want to live. So this means providing accurate, relevant, and timely information to make good decisions. Now, this came up several times in my interviews with older people. It was often repeated that it's so important to be able to look towards the future and to plan ahead. And what really struck me was the fact that this was really also dependent on the particular experiences and identity of the older people. So in one of our interviews, it came up that the particular person's sexuality informed the choices they made about where they wanted to live and informed the information that they sought out. Now, this really highlights that a one-size-fits-all approach, just won't work. It's important that this communication is tailored, targeted, and takes into account the diversity of older Londoners, their identities and their experiences, as well as their desires. So what recommendations did we draw out from our report? Centre for London is calling for a stronger and more coordinated approach to housing London's ageing population, and has therefore made recommendations to national, city, and local government. The first concerns setting targets and building specialist homes. Every London borough should set targets for how many specialist homes should be built each year and where. These targets should meet or exceed those benchmarked in City Hall's London plan. Local authorities should also do more to shape the range of options for older people in the area, and the government should reward those who build more older people's housing. Our second recommendation concerns communicating the options available. The government should provide dedicated funding to local authorities to provide older people's housing advice and support services. Local authorities should work with housing associations and community groups to reach people in their 50s and 60s about future housing choices. Thirdly, our last recommendation revolves around making homes adaptable as people age. Local authorities and developers should ensure that new built homes are designed to be adaptable and flexible, for example, by including step-free entrances and installing sockets at appropriate heights. I'd also like to highlight, however, that our report also calls for something quite fundamental too, and that's a shift in culture. So on one hand, it's one that recognizes the value that older people bring to our communities, and it's another that normalizes talking about and planning for our changing needs as we age. As Claire mentioned before, our report delves into this even more deeply, so I would advise you to read it, but that's it for me for now. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Nikita. That was a really great presentation and lots of food for thought there. In terms of the format for the rest of the event, I'm going to ask our panelists to share their responses to the research, and then we'll get a discussion going with the audience. I'm really pleased today to be joined by Phil Tait, who's the Head of Development at Canada Water, the British Land Development, which is close to my heart because prior to coronavirus, I used to commute through it virtually every single day, which is where the Jubilee Line meets the London Overground. A really interesting development, and Phil heads the development and delivery teams at that site, and before that he worked at Argent on commercial and residential developments at King's Cross, another really interesting area to us here at Centre for London. Joanne Drew is the Housing and Regeneration Director at Enfield Council, responsible for housing and good growth agenda at Enfield. It'll be really interesting to hear more about that. And she also leads for strategic development in Edmonton, which is the borough's most deprived area. I must stop saying that's another really interesting area, but it genuinely is another really interesting area. And she's the co-chair of the London Housing Directors, who take a pan-London approach to delivering a better housing market and solutions for the whole city. And finally, Abby Wood, who, like me, is someone who's come to these questions about how we support older people, having previously been involved in questions about how we support the very youngest people in our society. It's great to have you here with us, Abby, who is the Chief Executive of Age UK London, where she's been for just under a year. So thank you very much. If you're on Zoom, you can ask questions via the Q&A function. Thank you very much to the two people who have already done that, Izzy and an anonymous attendee. Thank you. And if you're probably already really used to this by now, you can upvote questions. So if you see a question you like, please upvote it rather than asking a similar one. And that way it will float miraculously up to the top for me to put to our panelists. I think we might have some people following the event today on YouTube rather than in Zoom. If you are and you want to feed in questions, please do so on Twitter using the hashtag #AgeFriendlyTwitCity, and our events and comms team will pick those up and miraculously float them into the Q&A for you so we can have a look at them. And we'll try to get through as many questions as we can before 10:30, which may mean I'm slightly favouritist in which ones I answer to get a really good range of questions. So I'd like to ask Phil to respond first, and maybe in particular, Phil, if you'd like to talk about what considerations you look at for older living at Canada Water, or maybe on some of the other developments that you've been working on. And it's been an interesting conversation we've had with developers throughout this project. What are the benefits for both older people and for the rest of us in living near urban areas, near high streets, in our city areas?
Hi. So the first question, how do we consider older living when approaching master planning? Well, I'll turn to our Canada Water scheme as a real example. Our master plan covers 53 acres. That scale is pretty unique. especially in inner London. But generally, master plans tend to have the luxury of space, which I think is hugely positive. It provides scope to respond to what people really want. And essentially, master plans strive to create successful places, places that appeal to people of all ages, both young and old. Our Canada Water project will create a new mixed-use urban centre. We've got around, as part of that, we've got around 3,000 homes to deliver Canada Water. And as part of this, we want to create an inclusive, intergenerational community. The idea being that different ages and abilities will live side by side, from student homes to dementia-friendly senior living, all hopefully coming together to share and enjoy the place, the public realm, and the amenities. So the starting point for us is to build inclusivity into the master plan, inclusive design where everyone feels comfortable. To help with our considerations, particularly at Canada Water, we spent 4 years listening to the local community, both young and old. So we involved people early on, and they helped us conceive the master plan and some of the fundamentals that underpinned it. And personally, I found it very refreshing to hear directly from people rather than developers having the answers for them. From those discussions, we found that the concept of shelter is important to the older community. They wanted places to dwell, to sit with family, with friends, or just be sheltered from the wind and rain. It does rain for about a third of the year in the UK. They want places to sit with good vistas, but also to feel part of a vibrant community whilst doing so. They wanted new town centre, but there are also existing aspects that they didn't want to lose, such as footpaths, places with special memories for them, and particularly local heritage. We wanted the master plan and want the master plan to support healthy lifestyles and well-being. So we've committed quite early on to provide attractive, well-designed open spaces with parks, green spaces and squares, and the ability to enjoy and engage some of the large bodies of water we have. We're also bringing forward over 2 kilometres of routes that will prioritise pedestrians over vehicles, and the provision alongside that of high quality public toilets and water fountains to support the enjoyment of the place. And hopefully the resulting environment will be inclusive, welcoming to people of all ages, and particularly the older people. Second point you made about the benefits of all of that. Well, I mean, from a developer's perspective, there is clearly commercial value to this. The broader the group of people in a place, particularly those with time and money to spend, the more successful that place is going to be, particularly for the businesses providing the food and drink and retail, but also for employers attracting the best talent and for the people living there themselves. And it goes without saying, there are a number of reports which demonstrate that having in particular specialist retirement properties can create more local economic value and more local jobs than any other residential housing type. There were stats out there in terms of, on average, 63% of older people spend their annual expenditure at local shops, coined by the Homes for the Later Living report as the silver saviours. So, incredibly important. Canada Water has a broad range of shops and services just now, the likes of which we intend to retain and add on to. The new master plan will create a high street and a pedestrian network of shops offering independence and recognised national chains. And we believe older people will make an important and valuable contribution to the economic activity to support this retail environment, and probably none more so than coming out of the current pandemic.
Fantastic. Thank you, Phil. Some really interesting food for thought there. Joanne, we can see that you're there, but we can't see your face. Can you hear us?
I can.
Oh, lovely. I hope if you can switch your camera on, that would be great. But if you can't, we will carry on regardless. Really interested to hear, in particular, your views on what local authorities can do to make sure they're building the older people's homes that are right for those particular areas and communities. And I know that Enfield have done some interesting work on intergenerational housing. So I wondered if you might also like to comment on that.
Okay. Can you see the video now, Claire?
We can, yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Yeah, in Enfield, we are a really interesting We have really acute housing pressures. So when we're asked, what's your housing need? It's kind of, we need much more of every type of accommodation in the borough to meet the pressures we face. When we were developing our housing and good growth strategy a couple of years ago now, with members, with residents and other stakeholders, we kind of all concluded that it was a really uninspiring range of housing products out there coming through in the market. You know, we're always battling against reducing the number of one-bed flats in new developments, and how can we create some more innovation in housing products so that we've really got more diversity to offer our residents. So I think that was the kind of foundation that led us to think about older people's housing, really. We've got a large Greek and Turkish community in the borough, and they are well known for multi-generational living. And that led us to think a bit more about intergenerational housing and whether that would meet the needs of residents. So we did an intergenerational housing design competition with an RP partner, which was Metropolitan Thames Valley. And we went out to architects to ask for calls for inspiring intergenerational solutions. And we got some really interesting outcomes from that. We're now so really about flexible spaces. The main conclusion from the competition was you need to have flexible spaces that can be private, can be shared, can be adaptable over people's changing circumstances, that reflect the need to have some social space but also privacy. So much more creativity and adaptability in the housing product. So we then set about thinking, how can we deliver that? And I think the challenge for a local authority with acute housing needs is that these things are often, atypical things are often more difficult to bring forward, and they're certainly more expensive. So the challenge for us is, how do we provide enough variation of housing at the pace we need? So obviously, as a local authority, we've got a range of different roles. So as the report says, it's really important that our local plan is setting the right housing targets for older people. It's really important that we're enabling and encouraging developers to bring forward the right solutions. But in Enfield, we also think it's important to take the initiative ourselves and to directly deliver solutions that the market isn't bringing forward. So that's why on our landmark development scheme in Meridian Water, on our council house building programme, we are initiating and developing ourselves housing. And that enables us, within the viability constraints that we all have, to bring forward solutions that are more creative to respond to our residents' needs. So that's one of the ways in which local authorities can tackle this issue. But we really do need the creativity of partners as well. So housing associations bringing their skills and expertise, as well as the development sector. So I think, Claire, that's the kind of background at Enfield, kind of trying to tackle this challenge in as many different ways as we can.
Thanks so much, Joanne. Really interesting, and it might be that people want to ask further follow-up questions about intergenerational housing as well. It was certainly an aspect of this that we found absolutely fascinating. Finally, I'd like to ask Abby, maybe in particular about what the government and GLA can do to help older people, and what we've called in this report, rising older people, to make the right housing decisions. And from Age UK London's experience, does this reflect, what are older people's big concerns that you hear about in terms of housing, and has that changed over the last year with coronavirus? I appreciate that those are big questions.
They really are, but I'm happy to have a go at them, and just also want to say how much we welcome this research and recommendations from it. The main concerns that we're picking up from older Londoners through the frontline work that's being done by the local Age UKs based in boroughs right across London are broader issues, but actually all of them have a connection into housing. So I thought it might be worth sharing those very briefly, and then I wanted to pick up a little bit about older people in the private rented sector. So the issues that we're most commonly hearing, the biggest challenges that older people are facing right now are, unsurprisingly, the top one far and away is social isolation, and connected to that, mental health problems. And then subsequently from that, problems from digital exclusion and also access to appropriate food. So taking the first problem there, there's obviously a huge housing connection with the question of social isolation. And one of the things that we are picking up from an awful lot of older people is the fear of going outside again and of venturing back into the wider world. So there are some people who are still advised to be shielding. There are some who aren't, but because they have been following the guidance and staying at home for so long, firstly, they're not feeling confident going out and about. It feels too much, too daunting, too overwhelming. And secondly, there's an awful lot, we've had this picked up by local services, that people's physical health has declined over the past year. Being less active, being out and about less often means that people, some older people have seen an increase in their frailty. So things that wouldn't have been so much of a challenge before, perhaps slightly uneven pavements or a series of steps, now feel like quite a daunting barrier to being out and about. I think there's a really useful lesson there. It's something that's picked up by both Phil and Joanne about accessible design and really highlighting the importance of housing in areas where there aren't literally physical barriers to older people going out and about, being active in their community and living their lives in the way that they want to. Then just to mention very briefly on both digital exclusion, obviously internet access, enormously important for those older people who have it. It can be a real lifeline at the moment, and for those who don't, it can cause real barriers. And then the question of access to food, I think, really picks up on what Phil was mentioning about the importance of being situated within a community, not a sort of older people living in an area on their own just with older people, but being close to local shops, to local community centres, being close to somewhere where they can buy affordable food and the sort of food that they need. I think the pandemic has really highlighted the importance of being within kind of close, easy walking distance of that and not relying necessarily on a bus journey. The other topic that I just want to pick up on in a little bit more detail is the challenges that are faced by older people who are living in the private rented sector. And it was great to see it covered in this report. This is something that Age UK London has really been campaigning on. It's worth flagging up that it's estimated over the next 2 decades, the number of renters over the age of 65 is going to double. There's a large number of people in their 30s and 40s renting at the moment, and we're expecting to see that move into more older people renting in the future. And renting can have benefits and can work very well for some people, but on the other hand, we do know that it poses some significant challenges. We know that housing in the private rent sector tends to be of a lower quality than in other sectors, and we have seen concerns about the number of non-decent homes within the private rented sector. So I think it's 1 in 4 older renters at the moment live in what would be deemed to be a non-decent home, so a home that's not in a reasonable state of repair. And obviously that had a negative impact on the quality of life and the health of those people even before the pandemic. Given now the amount of time that people have been spending at home, that's really been exacerbated. The other thing that I wanted to mention is the connection between social isolation and the private rented sector. So older people living in privately rented accommodation are more likely to have moved recently, and they're also less likely to know their neighbours and more likely to report feelings of isolation. And the importance of that has really been highlighted over the past year or so, when we've seen older people often relying quite heavily on informal social networks, on knowing their neighbours for things like being able to go out and get shopping for them. So some of the risks and downsides of that particular sector have really been exacerbated. So we would like to see much better information all round for older people on their various housing options. But I put in a particular plea right now for better information for older people in the private rented sector, because often there are assumptions that that's the sector that's absolutely dominated by younger people in their 20s and 30s. And there are some very specific needs that older people have in that sector. One thing we were particularly concerned by, we surveyed some older renters back in April of last year, so in the early stages of the pandemic. And one of the things we asked is, had their landlord simply been in touch since lockdown had kicked in? And 91% of them said no, but half of them said that would have been really, really important for them and supportive. So just a little flag for that. And also to mention that we have some information on our website of 8 things that landlords can do to help if they have older tenants living in their accommodation. So I will share that, and we'd love it if people could share that around.
Thank you so much, Abby. So much interesting stuff to pick up on there, and indeed in Joanne and Phil's comments. I'm going to take the questions in the Q&A slightly out of order. I hope you'll forgive me, because I think there's a really interesting one from Paul here about, given what Abby's just been saying about rental now being quite problematic, which again very much came up in our discussions with older Londoners in this report. I wondered if Joanne or Phil would like to respond on what the role of rental properties for older people might be in the future as a positive choice and a way to avoid rather than exacerbate the issues that Abby's just been talking about.
Shall I start, Claire?
Yes, please do. Thank you.
So I absolutely understand the concerns about the rental market and how it impacts on older people. Homelessness is driven by the PRS sector in Enfield, and we are starting to see more older people being affected by homelessness through that. One of the ways that we are trying to address that is in build to rent, which has obviously become quite a popular product across London. But in Enfield, we want to look at what we call an ethical build to rent product that the council would design, develop and manage itself, so it can have a stronger role in ensuring affordability of rents, ensuring that people in housing need are prioritised for the affordable housing. And then in regard to older people's accommodation requirements, we can think about how we support older residents as part of that scheme more broadly, with a kind of the potential to offer services to residents that enable them to stay supported in their homes for longer. And obviously as a local authority, we've got a vested interest in that, because without having assets that you can perhaps sell for your care in later years, the local authority picks up that responsibility. So it is something that we're proactively thinking about taking the initiative on in Enfield.
Thanks, Joanne. Really interesting. Phil, would you like to come in on that?
Kind of. It's not necessarily my area of expertise. I suppose I think it has a place. Older Londoners are not a homogenous group, so I think fundamentally more balanced delivery of product is required across all tenure types. And clearly there'll be the obvious question on affordability on rent, but equally better understanding of products. By that I mean, how older people can obtain equity release, etc., to help live their life the quality they want later on.
Thanks, Phil. Really interesting. I'd like to come on to Izzy Cole-Hamilton's question now. And thank you very much again, Izzy, for being the first person to ask a question. It's like being the person who's willing to come and sit at the front when you give a talk. It's always so grateful for the first person to do it. You were like, oh, they were going to do the Zoom equivalent of standing at the back and not saying anything. So Izzy's question for the panel is, could there be a standard for local authorities to provide this type of housing, by which I assume they mean specialist housing, for all stages of ageing in new developments and in residential areas? Joanne, I wonder if you'd like to come in on that.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. We are currently working on an extra care scheme as part of our development programme, and it's interesting in terms of the impact of the pandemic on the design thinking of that scheme. So it was initiated pre-pandemic, but it's making us think about more closely about how the communal spaces are designed, the internal layouts, the positioning of the scheme, to kind of make sure that it's kind of protective against the spread of the virus going forward. So I definitely think that there is a real need for some design thinking about these housing products. And again, in terms of engaging with older people, and planning reform kind of sets out the idea about having design guides for housing typologies. I think building from that, we definitely can start as a local authority to develop more creativity in typologies that we can then share with the development community to encourage something a little bit different in boroughs where we need that.
Thanks so much, Joanne. Phil or Abby, I know this is maybe less your area of expertise, but if you would like to come in, I would very much welcome you.
Yeah, happy to. You know, from a developer's perspective, it's all about balance. You know, providing affordable housing, and you know, we're definitely not adverse to providing housing, more special housing for older people. I suppose it's all about quantum and being practical in real life about the numbers that are required to seek efficiencies where they are located as well in terms of critical mass, operational expenditure costs, etc. It's very much the same challenge I think that are faced with general provision of affordable housing, to be honest. And if it's done sensibly and across the board, then it could be a helpful thing. It certainly needs to happen at some point.
Thank you. Abby, were you going to come in?
I don't think I've got much to add on top of that.
Sure, thank you. The next question takes us away a bit from housing that's defined for older people. It's from David Terrace, who asks, given that 90% of older Londoners live in general needs stock, as we've said in this report, and that there are still a huge number of non-decent homes in this stock, and that's something that I think Abby really put across strongly and has also come across in our research, not just this project, but generally. What are the panel's views on how to improve the current housing stock? So a nice small question there, panel.
Do you want me to start?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So in Enfield, we have 15,000 council-owned homes, and they are aged and require quite a lot of maintenance and investment to bring them up to the decent homes standard. So we would lobby for additional funding to enable us to make that investment more rapidly than we can through our housing revenue account. And I think the social housing white paper's got some policy thinking on that. One of the things that is a challenge for us, we've got 53 high-rise blocks, and obviously people live in them for many years and they age in them. And it's a different prospect to live in a high-rise block in your 60s, 70s and 80s than it is in your younger days when you have families, particularly in some of the blocks where we struggle to keep the lifts running because of the age and condition. So one of the things that we are doing is proactively looking at making best use of the stock, so supporting residents in high rise to move to lower rise properties and prioritising that in our allocations policy, if anything, but to support and manage risk from a building safety perspective as well from residents. But with the acute housing pressures we've got, the very limited amount of social housing, it's a real challenge actually to make best use of the stock. So under occupation is something that we really target as well. Wherever we can free up family accommodation and move people around, we will do. But the pressures on us are such a struggle that it's a difficulty to do that.
Yeah, I think it's really one of those cases where we see just pressures on housing for everybody, probably having a particularly bad effect on older people because of their higher needs, but it is definitely a pressure throughout the system. Abby, would you like to come in?
I'd probably say that there are two aspects to this. One is that the need for really a lot more information that's easier to track down. At the moment, there are different pockets of information, but it can be a real challenge to to find that information, or it's presented in a way that older people might think it isn't applicable to them, even though they're in that particular type of housing tenure. So making a huge amount more of that information accessible and really actively targeted at older renters, I think would make a huge difference. There are also some schemes around to support with adaptations, but there seems to be so far reasonably limited awareness of those. So things like funding that's available from the Disabled Facilities Grant and things like that could support the adaptation of existing homes. Greater awareness and greater use of that, we think, would be beneficial. And on top of that, older renters being aware that those things exist and being able to press their landlords for them could help.
Thanks, Abby. Yeah, one of the things that really strikes me working in this area is how difficult it can be to persuade people that, yes, this help that's available means you. And particularly of a generation, and at risk of stereotyping here, with a generation who are sometimes, I think, a little bit less inclined to say, well, no, I need this, I really need it, I paid my taxes and I really need it. We see people putting up with suboptimal situations, very suboptimal situations, where actually help maybe is available for them at that level of severity, but not coming forward. And there's a really strong investor save case there, isn't there? Because letting people be in housing that's completely inappropriate clearly very, very significantly increases the risk of accidents and ill health, and that's really no good at all for anybody. Phil, I wondered if you'd like to come in on that. I know, I'm sure that for British land, maybe less of an issue, but thoughts on improving current housing stock?
I honestly going to struggle to add to what Joanne and Abby said. I suppose it's access to adaptability, and whether there's any public support or public authority support to that. I mean, it's very different, obviously, private general housing versus local authority stock. I couldn't add to that, to be honest.
Thank you. I'm going to come to a question from Simon Hodgson here. Thank you for this, Simon. It's quite a long question, so excuse me for trying to summarise it. Simon's interested in the panel's views on how we should use local demographics and understanding of what specifically which groups of older people are living in an area and what are their needs. When local authorities look at determining planning applications, when developers are developing those plans, and when approving consents. Phil and Joanne, I wonder if you'd like to respond on how important it is for you to be thinking specifically about the local people in your area rather than local people in general.
I mean, I can speak from experience on Canada's Water and other master plans I've worked on, and as I alluded to before, it's just incredibly important. You have a local community in place, and you're about to build and disrupt their lives for a number of years to come. So understanding what they want, what their future requirements are, is incredibly important. And we spend a long time consulting with all people in the local community to find out what their interests are, and we hopefully shape the master plan to best suit that. I think going to one of the points in the questions, strong local connections, displacing people is not the right thing to do. So can we create communities which build and enhance? I mean, we will also be creating partly a new community coming in, building it together. So we do use a lot of demographics about what the makeup is of the local area, and we speak to them and listen to what they want.
Thank you. Joanne, would you like to come in? Joanne, I think you're on mute. Phrase of 2021.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, we're on a journey in terms of becoming more intelligence-led to inform policy and also our practice. We're quite good at it. We have a number of tools. Obviously, there's housing market information. There's census data that gives us profiles of our residents and their needs. We also have a tool that tells us about the affordability issues of residents. And part of our agenda is to work on more prevention-based service delivery, so work more upstream. And so I think it's really important to be able to predict the future needs, whether they're affordability needs, whether they're physical needs of residents, and to use that to inform our strategies. So I think we certainly do that, you know, in terms of building extra care homes and thinking about sheltered housing provision. We need to make sure that there's the demand in place and the right type of demand, and that will exist over the longer term. So it is something that we're doing, but you can never replace the personal feedback that you get from residents through knowing them and through engaging with them to supplement the kind of data intelligence that you're going to use to inform your policy.
Thanks, Joanne. Abby, would you like to come in on that? I'm conscious that it might not be Age UK London's core topic.
No, I think just to say that the approach that Joanne was talking about, kind of both looking at data and having conversations and really listening to older people, plus taking a preventative approach, music to my ears, that sounds wonderful. I'd like to see more people doing that.
Thank you. I'm going to use Chair's privilege here to ask one very last question, maybe for quick responses by the panel, which is to look for the future a bit. Thinking about today's 30 and 40 something Londoners, people like me, people like maybe some of my colleagues and some of the people in the audience, what are we going to need and want as we age, and how does that differ to what today's older people want and need?
I jump in on that one to say that from the estimates that we've seen, most of the houses that the 30 and 40-year-olds of today will be living in when they're older have already been built. So it's all about adaptations.
Thanks, Abby. Joanne or Phil, would you like to come in with some future speculation?
I think the only thing I would add is that it would be really great to see that generation being proactive with their thinking about their future housing needs, and working with organisations like local authorities that can help turn the vision into practical reality. I think it is quite a struggle with the existing older population when it's hard to engage with them and to support them into different routes. So I think if we can encourage people to be more proactive and to plan and think about their needs, I think that would be a great step forward.
Thank you, Joanne. Phil, any final thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm in the 40-something bracket, and I actually find it hard to say what I will want and need. But I suppose there's some fundamentals, you know, access to well-designed homes, well-designed amenities and public realm, sense of security, inclusive social community, and access to varying degrees of support and care as we get older. But I think, going to what Joanne says, for me, it's about improving product awareness. That's really important. Understanding of the local and the population of what housing products they are out there in the future.
Thank you so much for that, and thanks for tolerating that difficult question at the end. So thank you to Jason, Nikita, to Joanne and Phil and Abby today, and it's been such a pleasure to have you all with us. Thank you for your questions, to have this important question about better housing for older Londoners, and of course thank you once again to the sponsors of this project, some of whom are in the room: British Land, Riverstone, Enfield Council, the London boroughs of Barnet and Sutton, Populo Living, and the Royal Boroughs of Greenwich and Kingston upon Thames. Centre for London have more research and webinars coming up. We have so many more research and webinars coming up because for GLA elections looming, we're getting a lot in before March and the campaign truly begins. So please do sign up to our newsletter and follow us on Twitter. Deanne has put the links in the chat. A couple of ones that I thought might be particularly interesting to our audience today. Next week, we'll be talking about how we can involve the public, all Londoners, better in the planning system for our city, which kind of takes a step back from looking at particular groups to think about how we involve everybody in creating the city that we want to see. And a week after that, kind of touching on some of the topics that we've spoken about today about safety, but going much wider, we'll be launching a report about how London is lit. So thank you very much again for joining us. Really lovely to have you all here, and we hope to see you at some of those events.